On the morning of March 24, 1976, three neighbors in apartment building number 7 on Pervomaisky Prospect in Ryazan forced open the door to apartment 32 after repeated unanswered knocks over 2 days. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The apartment was fully furnished. The beds were made, dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink, a teacup left on the kitchen table, but there were no people, no clothing in the wardrobes, no shoes by the door, no photographs on the walls, no children's toys scattered on the floor. The Mironov family, 4 people who had lived in that apartment for 14 years, had vanished as if they had never existed at all, leaving behind a hollow shell of domestic life and rooms without inhabitants. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the building that would be quickly and methodically suppressed. But in those first hours, before the militia arrived and the official explanations began, the neighbors stood in the doorway of apartment 32 and felt the cold touch of something incomprehensible. Tamara Grigorievna Belova, who had shared tea with Irina Mironova just 3 days earlier, walked through the empty rooms, calling their names, her voice growing more desperate with each unanswered call. The apartment responded with silence, the particular quality of silence that comes from spaces recently abandoned, as if the air itself remembered the presence of those who were gone. The Mironov family had been a typical Soviet family in every way that mattered. Oleg Mikhailovich Mironov, 42 years old, had worked at the Ryazan machine-building plant for 16 years, rising from apprentice machinist to senior tool and die maker through steady competence and political reliability. He was known for his precision work, his ability to repair equipment that other machinists had given up on, his willingness to stay late when production schedules demanded it. His hands bore the scars of his trade, small burns from metal shavings, calluses from years of handling tools, and the permanent oil stains that marked men who worked with machinery. He was stocky and quiet, the kind of man who spoke carefully and infrequently at party meetings, who nodded at the appropriate moments during political lectures, who never drew attention to himself through either excellence or deficiency. Irina Sergeyevna Mironova, 39 years old, taught Russian literature at school number 14, a position she had held for 13 years. Her students remembered her as strict but fair, passionate about Pushkin and Tolstoy, insistent that literature could reveal truths about the human condition that ideology sometimes obscured. She never stated this belief openly, never challenged the required Soviet interpretations of the classics, but her students sensed it in the way she lingered over certain passages, the particular emphasis she placed on questions of individual conscience versus collective duty. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, dressed in the modest clothing appropriate for a Soviet teacher, and carried herself with a dignity that suggested she had once imagined a different life, but had long since made peace with the one she had. Their children, Maxim and Anya, were ordinary Soviet children, shaped by the standardized rhythms of young pioneer activities and schoolwork. Maxim, 13, had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and spent his free time taking apart old radios and attempting to rebuild them. Anya, 9, was bright and talkative, the kind of child who asked uncomfortable questions about why things were the way they were, questions her parents learned to redirect, with patient explanations about how the world worked. The family lived as millions of Soviet families lived at that time, navigating the gap between official ideology and daily reality, maintaining the performance of Soviet citizenship while harboring private doubts they shared only in whispered conversations late at night when the children were asleep. The Mironovs had moved into building number 7 in 1962, shortly after their marriage, into a 2-room apartment assigned through Oleg's factory housing allocation. The apartment measured 48 square meters, which was considered adequate for a family of 4 by Soviet standards. It consisted of a small kitchen, a bathroom with a shared hot water system that functioned intermittently, a living room that doubled as the parents' bedroom at night, and a smaller room where the children slept. The building itself was a standard 5-story Khrushchevka, one of thousands constructed across the Soviet Union during the mass housing program of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Buildings thrown up quickly to address the chronic housing shortage. Buildings that were already showing signs of deterioration within a decade of construction. The neighborhood on Pervomaisky Prospect was typical of Soviet provincial cities in the 1970s, a mixture of newer apartment blocks and older wooden houses, factories and schools, shops that were perpetually undersupplied, and parks where pensioners gathered to play chess and complain about rising prices. Ryazan itself, a city of approximately 500,000 people, located about 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow, had existed for nearly 900 years, but had been transformed by Soviet industrialization into a center of machine building, oil refining, and military production. The city's proximity to Moscow made it strategically important, and several of its factories produced equipment with defense applications, which meant the city had a higher-than-average presence of KGB personnel monitoring both the workforce and the general population. Life for the Mironovs followed the predictable patterns of Soviet working-class existence. Oleg's workday began at 7 o'clock, when the morning shift started at the machine-building plant. He would leave the apartment at 6:30, walking 15 minutes to catch the number 12 bus that ran along Moskovskoye Chaussee to the factory district. The plant manufactured precision equipment for agricultural machinery, though everyone understood that some of the equipment could be adapted for military use, which explained the presence of security officers who occasionally appeared in the workshops to ask seemingly random questions about worker loyalty and ideological commitment. Oleg worked a lathe in the tool and die shop, producing components that required tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, work that demanded concentration and provided little opportunity for conversation or political discussion. Irina's day began earlier, at 6 o'clock, when she would prepare a simple breakfast of kasha and tea for the family before waking the children. She would walk Anya to her school, located just 3 blocks away, before taking the trolley bus to school number 14, where she taught 4 classes of Russian literature to students ranging from 14 to 17 years old. Her classroom was on the 3rd floor of a pre-war building that had been repaired after German bombardment in 1941, but never properly renovated. A room with high ceilings, inadequate heating in winter, and windows that overlooked a courtyard where students smoked cigarettes during breaks and pretended not to notice when teachers walked past. She taught from approved textbooks that emphasized the progressive nature of Russian literary traditions and the ways in which even pre-revolutionary writers had unconsciously anticipated socialist realism, interpretations she delivered with professional competence, while privately maintaining her own understanding of the texts. The family's social life revolved around obligatory participation in collective activities and private moments stolen from the demands of Soviet public life. They attended factory cultural evenings and school parent meetings, participated in May Day demonstrations and October Revolution celebrations, voted in elections where only one candidate appeared on the ballot, and maintained the performance of enthusiastic Soviet citizenship that was required for professional advancement and social stability. But their private life, the life that mattered to them, took place in the apartment in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons, when Oleg would teach Maxim to repair household items and Irina would read to Anya from books that were not on any approved curriculum. The family took their meals together at the small table in the kitchen. They discussed ordinary things: Maxim's progress in mathematics, Anya's conflicts with a bully at school, the chronic shortage of fresh vegetables at the local market, plans for the upcoming summer when they hoped to spend 2 weeks at a trade union rest home on the Black Sea coast. These conversations were careful and calibrated to avoid topics that might be dangerous if overheard by neighbors in adjacent apartments where walls were thin and sound traveled easily. The Mironovs had learned, as all Soviet citizens learned, to practice a form of perpetual self-censorship, to monitor their own thoughts and words for deviations that might be reported, to maintain separate spheres of public speech and private belief. Tamara Grigorievna, who lived directly across the hall in apartment 31, had become friendly with Irina over the years through the small acts of mutual assistance that characterized Soviet apartment life. They borrowed sugar and salt from each other when supplies ran short, watched each other's children when emergencies arose, shared information about which stores had received shipments of scarce goods. Tamara's husband worked as an accountant at the Oblast Administration Building, a position that provided slightly better access to consumer goods through unofficial channels, and she would sometimes share these advantages with Irina. The two women would drink tea together in one apartment or the other several times a week, and shared in conversations that ranged from complaints about the quality of Soviet-manufactured clothing to more guarded discussions about their children's futures and whether the promises of communism would ever materialize into tangible improvements in daily life. On the evening of March 22, 1976, Tamara had knocked on the Mironov's door to return a book that Irina had lent her, a collection of Akhmatova's poetry that was technically available in Soviet bookstores but somehow always out of stock, a copy that Irina treasured and had shared reluctantly. No one answered her knock. She tried again an hour later, thinking perhaps they had gone out for an evening walk or to visit Oleg's mother, who lived across the city. Still no answer. This was unusual, but not alarming. Families had their own rhythms, their own reasons for being away from home. The next morning, March 23rd, Tamara noticed that the Mironov's door remained closed when Oleg should have been leaving for his early shift. She heard no sounds of morning routine, no water running in the bathroom, no voices of children being prepared for school. She told herself they might be sick, that the entire family might have caught the flu that had been circulating through the city. She knocked again around noon, thinking that if they were ill, she could offer to pick up medicine from the pharmacy or bread from the shop. No answer. She pressed her ear against the door and heard nothing. By the evening of March 23rd, Tamara's concern had deepened into something approaching fear, though she could not articulate exactly what she feared. She mentioned the Mironov's absence to her husband, who suggested practical explanations. Perhaps Oleg's mother had taken ill and the family had gone to care for her. Perhaps there had been some family emergency that required their immediate departure. But these explanations did not satisfy Tamara, who pointed out that even in emergencies, people left notes for neighbors, asked someone to water their plants, made some indication of their plans. The absence of any communication was what troubled her most deeply. On the morning of March 24th, Tamara knocked again, louder this time, and called out Irina's name. Still no response. She went downstairs and knocked on the door of apartment 10. That was where the building's house representative, Grigory Petrovich, lived. He had been chosen by the residents the previous year to speak with the district housing office and pass along complaints about heating, plumbing, and repairs. He kept a thick notebook of issues and was the one the inspectors asked for when they came through. He answered the door in his slippers. Tamara told him the Miranovs had not been seen for 2 days and asked if he could check on them using his copy of the apartment keys. Grigory shifted uncomfortably and reminded her that he was not supposed to enter an apartment without the tenants present, and that perhaps the Miranovs had simply gone away for a few days. Unusual, yes, but not unheard of. Tamara insisted. Her voice trembled with a nervous edge she did not fully understand. After a moment, Grigory sighed, took the keyring from the hook by his door, and agreed to go upstairs with her. He called across the stairwell for Pavel Ivanovich from apartment 28 to come along as a witness. They knocked loudly and announced themselves. When no response came, Grigory inserted the key into the lock. The lock turned, but the door would not open. Something was blocking it from inside. Pavel, a large man with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor, put his weight against the door and forced it open. The apartment beyond lay before them in a state that defied immediate comprehension. The furniture was all there, the same furniture that had been there days earlier when Tamara had last visited. The sofa, with its worn brown upholstery, the television set on its corner stand, the table with 4 chairs in the kitchen, the beds in both rooms, made with precision. But the apartment had been stripped of everything personal. The coat rack by the door stood empty. No shoes lined the entrance hall. The wardrobes in both rooms hung open, revealing empty space where clothing should have been. The bathroom shelves contained no toiletries, no soap, no toothbrushes. The kitchen cabinets held a few basic dishes and pots, but none of the accumulated items that filled any lived-in kitchen. Tamara walked through the rooms in a state of disbelief. She opened drawers and found them empty. She checked the bathroom and saw no towels. She went into the kids' room and found no toys, no books, no child's drawings pinned to the walls. She looked for the family photographs that had always stood on the shelf beside the television. Photographs of Oleg and Irina's wedding, of the children as babies, of summer vacations at the Black Sea. All gone. She checked the kitchen for Irina's collection of handwritten recipes, cards covered with her precise handwriting, detailing preparations for dishes learned from her mother and grandmother. Not there. Even the small things, like Irina's sewing kit, had vanished. The 3 neighbors stood in the living room trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Pavel suggested that perhaps the family had been evacuated, that some emergency had required their immediate removal. But this explanation collapsed under examination. Why would an evacuation require removing every piece of clothing, every photograph, every personal item, while leaving furniture and basic household goods? Grigory proposed that perhaps the family had decided to emigrate, that they had received permission to leave the Soviet Union and had departed suddenly. But this, too, made no sense. The emigration process took months or years and was accompanied by endless paperwork and official notifications. Families preparing to emigrate sold their furniture, said elaborate goodbyes, and made their departures into public events. Tamara felt the truth before she could articulate it, a cold certainty that settled in her stomach and spread through her limbs. Something had happened to the Miranovs, something that required their complete removal from this apartment, something that demanded not just their absence, but the erasure of all evidence that they had ever lived here as themselves, as individuals with histories and possessions and connections to the world around them. She thought about the conversations she had had with Irina over tea, the careful way Irina would sometimes phrase things when discussing political matters, the slight pause before she agreed with some official position, the look in her eyes that suggested she was thinking something different from what she was saying. Within 2 hours of the discovery, representatives from the local militia arrived at the building. Two officers in uniform who took brief statements from Tamara, Pavel, and Grigory before asking them to leave the apartment. The officers spent approximately 20 minutes inside before sealing the door with official tape and departing without offering any explanation, beyond stating that the matter was under investigation. By evening, the three men in dark civilian clothing had arrived. KGB operatives, though they did not identify themselves as such, men who spoke quietly with Grigory in the courtyard and made it clear through tone and implication that further curiosity about the Mironovs would be unwelcome. The following morning, a truck arrived and the systematic removal of the remaining items began. Workers emptied the apartment of its furniture, carrying everything down to the truck with practiced efficiency. Other workers arrived with painting supplies and plaster to repair any marks on the walls. By evening, apartment 32 was an empty box, ready to be reassigned to a new family who would never know that the Mironovs had existed. The official explanations began to circulate within days, each tailored to specific audiences. At the machine-building plant, Oleg's supervisor called a brief meeting of the tool and die shop and announced that Comrade Mironov had been selected for a classified project in the Urals, a sensitive assignment that required immediate relocation and prohibited communication with former colleagues. The announcement was delivered in a tone that discouraged questions, and none were asked. Oleg's workstation was cleared and reassigned to a new machinist within a week. At school number 14, the principal called Irina's fellow teachers together and explained that Comrade Mironova had accepted a prestigious teaching position at a specialized school in another city, an opportunity that had come up suddenly and required immediate action. The principal expressed regret at losing such a capable teacher, but emphasized that individual career advancement must sometimes take precedence over institutional continuity. Irina's replacement, a recent graduate from the Pedagogical Institute, began teaching her classes the following Monday. The children's classmates were told by their teachers that Maxim and Anya had moved to be closer to extended family members who required care, a common enough occurrence that it generated little discussion beyond a few days of speculation among the students before the rhythms of school life reasserted themselves and the missing children were forgotten. But among those who had known the Mironovs well, the official explanations rang hollow. Tamara could not reconcile the story of a planned transfer with the eerie emptiness of the apartment, the selective removal of personal items, the complete absence of any farewell or forwarding information. She attempted to inquire further, first with Grigory, who told her coldly that the matter had been resolved through proper administrative channels and required no further discussion. She tried calling the personnel department at Oleg's factory and was told that all information regarding Comrade Mironov's transfer was classified and could not be disclosed. She asked the school administration for Irina's forwarding address and received a letter stating that privacy regulations prohibited sharing such information. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Tamara received her visit from the KGB officer, a man in his 30s, wearing a neat grey suit, who appeared at her door one evening when her husband was working late. He identified himself only as a representative of state security and asked if he might come inside to discuss a routine matter. Once seated in her living room, he asked about her friendship with Irina Mironova, what they had discussed during their conversations, whether Irina had ever expressed dissatisfaction with Soviet life or made statements that might indicate ideological unreliability. The questions were posed gently, almost conversationally, but Tamara understood perfectly what was happening. She was being tested, her loyalty was being assessed, Her knowledge of the Miranovs was being evaluated for its potential threat to whatever operation had removed them. She told the officer what he needed to hear, that Irina had been a loyal Soviet teacher who never expressed anything but enthusiasm for socialist education, that their conversations had been limited to domestic matters and child-rearing, that she had noticed nothing unusual about the family before their departure. The officer made notes in a small leather notebook, thanked her for her cooperation, and left after making a comment that struck her as both warning and advice. He said it was important to respect the privacy of those who serve the state in sensitive positions, and that unnecessary curiosity about administrative matters could sometimes be misinterpreted as interference with state security. Tamara assured him she understood completely. After he left, she sat in her kitchen trembling, understanding that she had just participated in the final erasure of her friend, that by denying any meaningful knowledge of Irina, she had helped confirm that the Miranovs could safely be forgotten. What Tamara and the other neighbors could never know, what would not emerge until decades later through scattered document releases after the Soviet Union's collapse, was the chain of events that had led to the Miranovs' disappearance. The beginning, as with so many Soviet tragedies, was trivial, a moment of honest observation that in any normal society would have passed unremarked, but in the paranoid atmosphere of 1970s, Soviet life became the seed of a catastrophe. 6 months earlier, in September 1975, Oleg had attended a mandatory party meeting at the factory where workers discussed strategies for meeting the production quotas outlined in the 5-year plan. These meetings followed a predictable script. The shop foreman would present statistics about current production levels, identify gaps between current performance and required targets, and call upon workers to offer suggestions for improvement. The suggestions were usually bland affirmations of the need for greater effort and socialist competition. But on this particular evening, perhaps tired or distracted, or simply forgetting the rules of the performance, Oleg had spoken honestly. He had raised his hand and, when called upon, had suggested that rather than simply demanding higher output through exhortation and political pressure, the factory management should address the chronic equipment failures and material shortages that actually limited production. He had noted, citing specific examples from his workshop, that machines were breaking down because spare parts were allocated to other facilities with higher priority, that raw materials were arriving in inconsistent quality that required additional machining time, that workers were willing to meet quotas but lacked the functioning tools to do so. His comments were delivered respectfully, framed as constructive criticism aimed at genuinely improving efficiency. But in the context of Soviet political culture, they represented a dangerous deviation. The mistake was compounded by timing and circumstance. Oleg's supervisor, the head of the tool and die shop, was at that moment under investigation by the KGB's Second Chief Directorate on suspicion of having had unauthorized contact with members of a West German technical delegation that had visited the factory the previous year as part of a trade exchange program. The investigation had found no evidence of actual espionage or classified information sharing, but the mere fact of investigation had placed the supervisor under scrutiny. When Oleg made his comment at the party meeting, it was interpreted not as an individual worker's frustration, but as potential evidence of the supervisor's ideological laxity, his failure to maintain proper political discipline among his subordinates. A notation was placed in Oleg's personnel file, a brief entry in bureaucratic language noting that he had engaged in criticism of Soviet industrial planning during a party meeting. The notation was coded in a way that flagged it for potential security review, marking Oleg as someone whose ideological reliability required monitoring. In the vast machinery of Soviet surveillance, this notation might have remained dormant indefinitely, one more data point among millions. But in February 1976, the KGB's Ryazan office received a directive from Moscow's KGB 5th Chief Directorate, the division responsible for suppressing ideological dissent, instructing regional offices to identify and process individuals whose files contained markers of potential unreliability in advance of the upcoming 25th Party Congress, scheduled for late February. The directive was part of a broader pattern of preemptive repression that characterized Soviet security operations during this period. The Party Congress would bring together delegates from across the Soviet Union to celebrate achievements and set future goals, and the KGB wanted to ensure that no incidents of protest or dissent would mar the proceedings. Regional officers were given quotas, though these were never officially acknowledged, to demonstrate vigilance by processing a certain number of cases involving potential troublemakers. Oleg Mironov's file, flagged 6 months earlier, came to the attention of Major Yevgeny Andreevich Kuzmin during this review process. Kuzmin was a career KGB officer who had joined the organization in 1967 and spent his first 7 years in the Second Chief Directorate conducting counterintelligence operations before transferring to the Ryazan office in 1974. He was 34 years old, ambitious, methodical, and thoroughly indoctrinated in the KGB's institutional worldview that saw potential threats everywhere and regarded preemptive action as not just justified but necessary for state security. When he reviewed Oleg's file, he saw not an individual worker who had made a reasonable suggestion, but a potential vector for ideological contamination. His analysis, documented in a report he submitted to Colonel Dmitry Pavlovich Orlov, who headed the Ryazan office, noted that Oleg had access to technical specifications for industrial equipment, some with potential military applications. He observed that Oleg's wife worked as a teacher with regular access to young people whose political consciousness was still forming. He noted that the children were approaching adolescence, a stage when parental influence was particularly strong. His recommendation was clear and decisive. The Mironov family represented an unacceptable risk and should be subject to administrative resolution, the bureaucratic euphemism for removal outside the legal system. On March 19, 1976, Colonel Orlov approved Kuzmin's recommendation. The operational plan was prepared over the next 2 days. Implementation was scheduled for the night of March 22nd, timing chosen to minimize the chance of witnesses. The team of 8 operatives would enter the apartment, secure the family, transport them to separate processing facilities, and then return to remove all personal items from the apartment. The operation would be conducted with maximum efficiency and minimum visibility. At approximately 3 o'clock on the morning of March 23rd, the operation began. The team entered building number 7. They moved up the stairwell to the 3rd floor and positioned themselves outside apartment 32. Major Kuzmin gave the signal, and they entered, moving through the apartment with practiced coordination that came from having executed similar operations multiple times before. How they obtained the keys to unlock the door remains unclear to this day. Oleg woke first, sensing a presence in the darkened apartment. He started to rise from the bed, but was immediately restrained by 2 operatives who pinned his arms and forced him back down. Irina woke to see men standing over their bed, her husband struggling against restraints, and opened her mouth to scream. An operative placed a firm hand over her mouth, while another produced a syringe and administered a sedative that would keep her docile during transport. In the children's room, Maxim and Anya were secured before fully waking, confused and terrified, but unable to resist. The family was dressed quickly in outdoor clothing pulled from their wardrobes, a detail carefully planned to support the cover story that they had left voluntarily. They were led down the stairwell and placed into separate vehicles, Oleg restrained with handcuffs in one vehicle, Irina still drowsy from sedation in another, the children in a third vehicle with a female operative who told them in soothing tones that everything would be fine, that they were going on a special trip, that their parents were safe, and they would all be together soon. The vehicles departed separately, taking different routes to different destinations. Oleg was driven to the KGB detention facility in the basement of the Oblast Administration building on Soviet Street, a facility that existed in official documents but was unknown to the building's regular occupants and visitors. The facility had been constructed during the building's original design in 1958, included in the architectural plans as a standard feature that all regional administration centers were required to maintain for security purposes. Oleg was processed through intake procedures, photographed, fingerprinted, subjected to a brief medical examination, and placed in cell number 5, a small concrete room with a steel cot, a bucket, and a single dim bulb that remained lit continuously. No charges were filed. No interrogation was conducted. He was simply held in administrative limbo while the next stages of processing were prepared. Irina and the children were transported to the former tuberculosis sanatorium near Spassk Ryazansky, approximately 60 kilometers north of Ryazan. The facility had been repurposed by the KGB in 1968 as a transit point for individuals undergoing administrative processing, people whose cases required handling outside normal legal channels. Irina, still affected by the sedative, was placed in a locked room and left to sleep off the medication. The children were taken to what had once been the pediatric ward, now converted into holding rooms for families undergoing processing. A woman who identified herself as Nurse Svetlana told them their parents were being treated for illness but would be fine, that they needed to be patient and cooperative, that good behavior would lead to faster reunification. Over the following 2 weeks, each family member was subjected to systematic processing that documented their existence while simultaneously preparing for their removal from official records. They underwent medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and were photographed extensively. The evaluations were conducted by KGB personnel trained in providing the documentation necessary to justify administrative detention. Oleg was assessed as showing signs of ideological instability and poor social adaptation. Irina was determined to have been exposed to her husband's views and therefore represented a potential transmission vector for ideological contamination. The children were classified as being at high risk of developing antisocial attitudes if left in normal educational environments. On April 7, 1976, the processing was complete, and the final disposition decision was made. The Mironov family would be transferred to Special Administrative Point 147 in Perm Oblast, a remote detention facility in the Ural forests that held approximately 200 people, all of them erased from Soviet society for reasons ranging from genuine political dissent to bureaucratic convenience. The facility had begun as a Gulag camp during Stalin's era and had been repurposed after the Gulag system's official closure to serve as a holding point for individuals who could not be processed through standard judicial channels. The family arrived at Special Administrative Point 147 in mid-April after a 4-day journey in a prison transport vehicle. They were separated upon arrival. Oleg was assigned to the male barracks and put to work in the facility's woodworking shop. Irina and the children were housed in a barracks designated for families, with Irina assigned to kitchen work and the children placed in a makeshift school operated by other detainees. They were permitted to see each other for 1 hour each Sunday afternoon in a supervised visiting area. Life at the facility followed rigid patterns unchanged for decades. Wake at 6, eat breakfast of watery porridge, work from 7 until 6 in the evening with a brief lunch break. Dinner at 7, followed by 2 hours of controlled free time, lights out at 10. The detainees existed in indefinite limbo, held without charges or release dates, their fates dependent on bureaucratic decisions that might never come. Some had been there for years. Some would remain for decades. The average stay was 7 to 12 years, assuming survival. What made their situation particularly devastating was that unlike actual prisoners serving defined sentences, they had no framework for hope, no date to count down to, no mechanism for appeal or rehabilitation. They had simply ceased to exist in the official Soviet world. Their names had been removed from all standard documentation. Their employment records showed administrative transfers to classified locations. Their housing had been reassigned. Their friends and colleagues had been encouraged or intimidated into forgetting them. They had been erased as completely as the Soviet state could manage, existing now only in the remote facility in the Urals and in the sealed files of the KGB. Back in Ryazan, the apartment was reassigned in early April to a young couple, both engineers at the oil refinery who moved in knowing nothing about the previous occupants. The housing committee representative said nothing. The new residents painted the walls and installed their furniture, beginning their lives in a space where 4 other lives had been violently interrupted. Within months, the Mironovs were largely forgotten by the community where they had lived for 14 years, erased from memory as efficiently as they had been erased from official records. A document discovered in the Perm Oblast KGB archives in 1993, during the brief period of openness following the Soviet collapse, listed individuals held at Special Administrative Point 147 during the 1970s and 1980s. It included entries for Oleg, Irina, Maxim, and Anya Mironov, with arrival dates in April 1976. Next to Oleg's name was a notation showing death on March 3, 1983, cause listed as myocardial infarction, heart failure, nearly 7 years after his arrival. He was 49 years old. Irina's entry showed no death date, suggesting possible survival until the facility's closure in 1989. The children's entries similarly showed no death dates. Whether they survived, what became of them if they did, remains unknown. The story of the Mironov family represents one thread in a vast tapestry of Soviet repression that remained largely hidden during the Cold War and has been deliberately obscured since. The mechanisms that enabled their erasure, the bureaucratic procedures, the institutional complicity, the social silence, were replicated in countless cases across the Soviet Union throughout the decades of communist rule. Estimates based on partial document releases and testimony from former KGB officers suggest that thousands of families underwent similar fates during the Brezhnev era. Some were removed for more substantial reasons, having engaged in actual dissident activity, but many others were swept up for minor infractions, or simply because they came to the attention of security organs at moments when examples needed to be made. Oleg's crime was to have spoken honestly about industrial inefficiency. For this, he died in a remote camp at age 49. His wife lost 13 years of her life, if she survived that long. His children's adolescence was stolen, their education interrupted, their futures destroyed. They vanished into the administrative void that the Soviet state had perfected, leaving behind only fragments of memory and sealed documents that tell a story the Russian government still prefers to keep hidden.